Welcome back to Tales from the Dark Room. Tonight we're stepping into the chilling shadows of September, a month not only of fading summer, but of true, unforgettable horror. Our first story is one of the most enduring urban legends, especially here in America. I don't know if you've heard it before or not, but it goes like this. A late-night drive. The year was 1972. John, a truck driver, was making his way through a thick fog on a deserted back road in western Pennsylvania. It was around midnight, and the road was so empty he hadn't seen another car for miles. That's when he saw her, standing at the edge of the road in a thin white light dress, shivering like she was cold despite the muggy September night. He pulled over and walked back to her, and he asked if she wanted a ride. Yeah, she nodded, eyes downcast, and without a word she got into the truck and closed the door. Then John turned up the radio to fill the awkward silence as he started driving again. But after a few moments he glanced at her and his blood ran cold. The girl wasn't looking out the window or fiddling with the radio. Her face was buried in her hands, and there wasn't a sound coming from her except a low sob. John took a deep breath and reached over to pat her shoulder, asking if she was all right. The girl shook her head, then looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "but I have to get home. Can you take me?" John knew the roads well, and he could see no streetlights in the distance, only the dense, dark woods on either side of them. "What's your address, love?" he asked gently, wanting to help her. "Just tell me where you live and I'll drive you home." "Okay," the girl said softly, "but please hurry. It's getting late." Then she gave him an address, and John set his teeth as he recognized it. It was out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by those same dark woods. He slowed the truck as they approached the house, a small ramshackle structure with overgrown weeds in its yard and flickering lights in the windows. Then suddenly the girl was gone. John jolted upright, slamming on the brakes and yanking the door open. But the seat beside him was empty, bare, except for a lingering chill. There was no sign of the girl anywhere, nor any sound from inside the house. It was deathly silent. John hesitated, a chill snaking down his spine, before he stepped out of the truck and knocked on the door. A moment later, a man and woman opened it, their faces etched with surprise. "Can I help you?" the man asked cautiously, eyeing John and his truck. Hi," John stammered. "I brought someone here, a girl who looked like she needed some help. She said her name was..." He paused, remembering. "Mary." The couple exchanged a confused look. "Mary?" the woman echoed, her voice tight. "But Mary died 5 years ago, on this road, on this very night." John felt a chill crawl up his neck. Had he picked up a ghost? Before he could respond, the man quickly shut the door, and John hurried back to his truck. As he drove away, he risked a glance over his shoulder. The couple stood by the door, their silhouettes framed by the light inside. They were crying. And now, every September, the story unfolds anew. The truckers passing by, caught in the mist, hear the faint strains of a woman's laughter echoing from the trees. And every September, they feel the icy touch of her hand on their arm, beckoning them closer to the road's edge. Well, I don't know about you, but that story makes me want to keep my windows rolled up and my doors locked whenever I hitchhike, which is never. But our next story will make you want to lock your doors in your own home, and we haven't even begun to tell it yet. So hold on to your pillows, children, because the night has just begun. We are going deeper into the shadowy recesses of September, a month that seems to hold more than its share of terrifying tales. Now let me tell you another, one about a boy named Tommy and his newfound friend. One evening in the early 1980s, Tommy and his sister Patty were playing hide and seek in their house. Their mother was busy in the kitchen, and their father was watching TV downstairs. But as Patty raced up the stairs, she noticed something strange. A dark shadow seemed to be dancing on the wall just beyond her sight, and a whisper brushed against her ear saying, "Find me." Intrigued, Patty called out to her brother, "Tommy, come here. There's something weird going on." Tommy came bounding up the stairs, and together the siblings tried to make sense of the shadow and the whispers, which seemed to be coming from within the walls. They called out to their parents, but their voices echoed unanswered in the vastness of the old house. Suddenly the whispers grew louder, urging them toward the attic door. Hesitantly, Patty pushed the door open and gasped. The attic was filled with a swirling darkness that seemed to writhe like a living thing. The whispering grew stronger, beckoning them deeper into the gloom. With Tommy holding on tightly to Patty's hand, they ventured into the darkness. The air grew colder, and a musty smell like old books and decaying wood filled their nostrils. The whispering intensified, becoming voices now, murmuring secrets in a language they couldn't understand. Then, through a crack in the gloom, they saw it. A figure made of pure darkness huddled in the corner. It was small, childlike, with what looked like tendrils reaching out from its edges. Patty and Tommy froze, fear gripping their hearts as the whispering grew into a chorus of voices chanting, "Find me, find me." They wanted to run, but their feet felt rooted to the floor. And then the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Slowly, the darkness began to recede, revealing the attic's dusty contents, old trunks, forgotten toys, and cobwebs. The whispering didn't return that day, but it stayed with Patty and Tommy, weaving its way into their dreams and their waking hours. As the years passed, the siblings tried to forget the attic's horrors, burying themselves in school and work. Yet the whispers persisted, growing louder each September. Then one day, an old family album offered a clue. In one faded photograph, Patty and Tommy saw the source of the whispers. A little girl in a Victorian nightgown standing by an old trunk, her face obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. The girl had been erased from the family's memory, and perhaps that's why she whispered for them to find her. Driven by a need to set things right, Tommy and Patty returned to their childhood home, determined to uncover the truth behind the whispering girl. Oh, and while the house remained unchanged, neither the mother nor the father did, and they barely recognized their children. "We've moved on," their mother said sadly, "and you should too. Let the past stay in the past." But Tommy and Patty couldn't. Every September, the whispering grew louder, a constant reminder of their forgotten past. Then one day, they found an old diary hidden in the attic, filled with their father's neat handwriting. And as they read, they learned the truth. Their father had adopted the little girl, calling her Mary. But one September night, she had slipped out of her room and vanished, never to be seen again. Some said she ran away, but Tommy and Patty believed otherwise. And as they delved deeper into Mary's story, they discovered that each September, on the anniversary of her disappearance, the whispering girl sought their help. This was her way of reaching out, of tugging at their hearts to be found. Determined to honor Mary's memory, Tommy and Patty decided to build her a proper grave, a place where she could finally rest in peace. With the help of their parents, they held a small funeral in the backyard, laying to rest the bones of a forgotten child. The whispering girl was laid to rest. The annual chorus of voices seeking to be found became a gentle murmur, a lullaby to soothe a troubled spirit. Finally, at the end of September, the whispers ceased altogether. Well, this story may have a happy ending, children, but it serves as a reminder that sometimes the spirits that walk among us are not lost, but simply searching for a place to call home. And now, as our stories draw to a close, so does our time for tonight. If you enjoyed these tales, show your support, because the more likes and comments, the more shadows we can bring to life. Until next time, remember, the scariest stories aren't always told, but sometimes whispered in the dark. Sweet dreams if you can, and don't forget, the spirits are watching. Welcome back to Tales from the Darkroom. Our next September nightmare comes from the deep forests of Oregon. Camping is supposed to be about peace and solitude. Sometimes, though, the silence of the woods hides something waiting to be heard. Two college friends camp in a remote Oregon forest in September 2012. They set up their tent late on the first day, so they only had time for a quick hike around the tent before dark. But the quiet was unsettling. No birds tweeting, no squirrels chattering, not even crickets chirping. It was eerie. Back at the tent, they made dinner over the small fire and soon went to bed. Around 2 a.m., one of them woke up to what sounded like footsteps near the tent. At first, he thought it was a bear, but then the sound stopped right outside the tent. Then they started again, slowly circling the tent. Now he was scared. He shook his friend awake and told him to listen. They both sat there listening intently. Footsteps continued to circle the tent, getting closer and closer. Then the sound stopped. Moments later, a deep, guttural voice whispered right outside the tent. "Not tonight." The tent was silent except for their pounding hearts. Neither of them had ever heard such a voice. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was something else. The footsteps began again, this time moving away from the tent. They circled once more, coming closer, then farther away. Then another voice, just as deep and guttural, whispered, "Go away." The two friends didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their things and fled into the darkness, stumbling over each other in their haste to get away. They didn't stop running until they reached the ranger station at the edge of the forest, nearly 3 miles away. Back at the campsite, the sun was already rising. As the forest stirred to life with birdsong and buzzing insects, the ranger listened to their story, his expression growing more serious by the minute. "Every September," he finally said, "we get reports of strange voices out in these woods. People say they hear whispers and guttural screams in the middle of the night. They hear footsteps and see shadowy figures darting through the trees, but no one ever seems to find anything. I've sent search parties out several times, but all we ever find are a few disturbed leaves and maybe some broken branches. Whatever is out there, it's good at hiding." He looked at the two friends, still pale and shaken from their experience. "I'd never heard of anything like that happening before, and I don't know if I want to." He handed them a map. "There's an abandoned ranger station a few miles up. From there you should be able to get cell service. Do you have anyone you need to call?" They shook their heads. We need to get home." He watched them go, still shaken from their encounter with whatever lurked in the forest. As the miles clicked by on the forest road, the friends were relieved to see the last of the trees behind them. They turned onto a familiar road and soon pulled into their driveway. Safe at last. Later that week, after telling their tale to their families, they returned to the forest to retrieve their tent and supplies. As they drove toward the ranger station, they passed a sign that read, "Lost Creek Wilderness Area, 1897. The friends looked at each other, confused. According to their map, the ranger station should have been here. But this was clearly marked Lost Creek Wilderness Area. Had they really been camping in the wilderness? Or was the ranger lying about the forest's dangers? Had they imagined hearing those voices in the middle of the night? But then they saw it, the abandoned ranger station, empty and dilapidated. The windows were boarded up and the front steps creaked ominously. It looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. As they approached the building, they noticed a weathered wooden box nailed to a tree nearby. Inside they found a dusty notebook. One of the pages had writing on it. In neat cursive it read, "September 1897, the Lost Creek Massacre. On the night of September 1897, the entire Lawson family was murdered in their cabin by unknown assailants. Their bodies were never recovered, but their blood soaked the ground where their cabin once stood. To this day, the spirits of the Lost Creek family roam these woods, seeking peace or perhaps revenge. Those brave enough to venture into the forest in September may hear their cries or feel their cold hands brush against theirs in the darkness. Be warned, if you hear their voices calling your name, do not answer, for those who do are never seen again." As the friends read the final sentence aloud, the wind suddenly picked up, whipping through the trees and swirling around them. The box flew out of the others' hands, crashing to the ground. Startled, they quickly got into the car and slammed the door. As they drove away, they could have sworn they heard whispers coming from the trees. They didn't dare turn back to look. What they read about the Lost Creek family explained everything. Of course, there was no ranger station on the map, because it had been abandoned long ago. And those guttural voices weren't a bear or some wild animal. They belonged to the Lost Creek family and whoever had killed them. Had they spent the night near the massacre site? Was that why they had been circled by unseen footsteps? And why did the voices tell them not to stay? They didn't want to find out. From that day forward, they avoided the forest in September. They never spoke of the horrifying experience to anyone else. They couldn't bring themselves to go back. They knew the forest held their darkest nightmare. And in September, the woods remember. This was the camping incident. You're listening to Tales from the Dark Room, where every shadow tells a story. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't yet. That way you won't miss our next story. which will premiere this Friday. Also, please give us a review. We love reading your feedback. Now, if you're still listening, you might be wondering how you can support this channel. Well, first, you can hit that like button if you haven't already. That helps us keep making new episodes. Second, you can follow us on social media to see exclusive content and get updates on new episodes. Third, you can follow me on my personal account to see sneak peeks of upcoming episodes. And finally, we have a support page. If you want to help us make the best show possible, you can become a patron and gain access to bonus material and your name in the credits. Until next time, keep your lights on. This has been The Camping Incident from the Dark Room, and in September, the woods remember. Stories that leave you questioning everything. That's what we do here. And tonight, we're going somewhere simple, a small-town motel off the highway. You're listening to Tales from the Dark Room. And all the way back on September 17th, 1985, traveling salesman Richard Locke checked into the motel room for the night. He was alone, had no known enemies, and no reason to believe he would not wake up bright-eyed and ready to sell another day's worth of vacuum cleaners. We don't know much about the man, just that he was a traveling salesman who booked a room at the Pine Ridge Motel in Texas under an assumed name. Under the alias Mr. Williams, he paid for his room in cash, didn't interact much with the staff, and retired early to his room, which was number 6. Now, this might seem like an unremarkable event, but there were two things about Mr. Williams, or Richard Locke, or whoever he really was, that would become very remarkable. First, he apparently requested room 6 specifically when he checked in, which was strange because room 6 rarely got rented. And second, once he went to bed, he locked the room door and didn't come out. At first, the motel staff didn't think anything of it. They were used to people sleeping late, especially on weekends, and so they knocked on the door around noon on Sunday the 18th, called in, and got no answer. So they just waited till later in the afternoon and then tried again. Now, since they had no key to Mr. Williams or Mr. Locke's room, they needed to wait until housekeeping arrived to let them in. But when they finally got in, they found something horrible. The man was dead. Apparently, he'd been sitting in bed fully clothed, leaning up against the headboard, eyes wide open, staring straight ahead of him with a slight smile on his face. According to the coroner, he'd been dead for several hours, but there was no sign of struggle and no apparent cause of death. Police were called in, but without any signs of foul play, they were stumped. It wasn't until after they pried open the locked room door and searched the premises that they found Richard Locke's car with his wallet inside. His identification confirmed his real name, and after reaching out to family, they determined that he did in fact have a reason to be in Texas. He was a traveling salesman, which is a nice term for someone who goes door to door selling useless gadgets. And according to his family, he was scheduled to visit clients in the area before continuing west. But Richard never made those appointments. The police also learned that Richard was carrying a considerable amount of cash on him, and that he'd recently had an argument with his wife, a fight that she claims was heated, but not violent enough to warrant police attention. There were no obvious signs of trauma on his body. His clothes were intact, nothing appeared to be stolen from the room, and the window was sealed shut from the inside, with its thin curtains drawn tight. In other words, Richard hadn't been robbed by intruders, nor did it appear as if he'd been poisoned, beaten, stabbed, shot, or otherwise injured, in such a way as to explain his sudden demise. And when the police opened the door to Richard's room, they found it empty, except for the corpse. There was no sign of forced entry and no indication that he'd been attacked. His death remained a total mystery, a puzzle with seemingly no missing pieces. Strangely though, this wasn't the first time something like this had happened at the Pine Ridge Motel, not even close. See, every September for the last 5 years, someone had checked into room 6. A guest who almost always booked under a false name, and who would pay for their accommodations in cold, hard cash. They were always alone, and usually middle-aged, and they always requested room 6. The staff had come to know about the annual visitor, and dreaded their arrival because without fail, they would lock themselves in the room and never come out. When the guests failed to check out by noon, the staff would go to their rooms, find the doors bolted from the inside, and break in only to discover the guest dead, sitting upright in bed, smiling faintly, completely lifeless. But there was always one thing that baffled the police more than any other. The door to the room was locked from the inside and the windows sealed. Nobody had broken in. There were no signs of foul play and no witnesses. How did these people die? Well, to answer that question, we're going to have to look beyond the Pine Ridge Motel. Now, I should state here that I haven't been able to find any record of these strange deaths occurring in real life. There was never a string of unexplained deaths at a motel, at least not one that gained any media attention. So what I'm about to tell you is pure fiction, based on a hypothetical scenario that may or may not have occurred in some parallel universe. In this alternate dimension, the guest who died in room 6 in 1985 was the first of many victims. Over the next 25 years, countless people met their end in the exact same manner. They'd check in, retire to their room, bolt the door, seemingly fall asleep, and never wake up again. Their bodies eventually being discovered by the horrified motel staff. But how did they die? One of the prevailing theories posited that the guests were somehow dying from carbon monoxide poisoning, despite the windows being tightly sealed. But this theory didn't hold up. After examining the room, testing air samples and interviewing witnesses, authorities couldn't find any evidence of deadly gases leaking in from outside. Another theory posited that the guests were doing something more sinister in the room, self-inducing their own demise through drug overdoses, gas inhalation, or God knows what else. But again, there was no evidence of foul play. Witnesses reported smelling nothing unusual coming from the room, and the guests were never found with any illegal substances. There was simply no explanation for these deaths, and it was only after consulting the guests' families and digging deeper into their backgrounds that authorities noticed a pattern. Every victim was born in the month of September, and every victim had recently experienced some sort of personal loss, often triggered by the anniversary of another loss. For example, the woman who died in 2002 had lost her daughter in a car accident exactly 3 years prior. The man who died in 2007 lost his wife in a house fire 5 years before. And the young girl who died in 2010 lost her father in combat exactly 10 years to the day of her own death. These guests weren't just dying in room 6. They were dying because of room 6. Now, the only piece of evidence the police could actually hang their hats on was witness testimony, claiming to hear strange noises coming from the room during the night, sounds described as whispers, screams, sobs, laughter, and even voices calling out names. Sounds that seemed to emanate from the room itself, and that grew increasingly louder as the night wore on. It was almost as if the room was feeding off the guests' sorrow. As the years passed and more guests checked into room 6, the pattern became too much to ignore. Authorities realized they were dealing with some kind of supernatural phenomenon, and so they sealed off room 6, boarded up the windows, and put up signs warning people to stay away. But to this day, strange lights are reported flickering on and off inside the room, and disembodied voices can be heard whispering down the motel hallway. And if you listen closely, you might hear them calling out your name. The motel has long since been abandoned, left to rot in the middle of the desert, its rooms overgrown with weeds and its parking lot cracked and crumbled. But every September, the wind seems to carry whispers from the room, whispers of loved ones lost and souls forever damned. And if you dare investigate, you might just find yourself drawn to room 6, where the darkness is deepest and the nightmares are always real. That was room 6, and now you know what happens when you check in. That was another installment of Tales from the Dark Room, the series where the past never checks out. If you enjoyed this terrifying tale, please make sure to leave us a like and comment below with your suggestions for future episodes. I don't know about you guys, but I am definitely never checking into a room with a number ending in 6 ever again. Also, while you're down there, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Until then, happy haunting, and I'll see you soon.